came this afternoon. He met some people. He recognized only 2 or 3 faces from the early days, obviously. The other person he knows, Costa, is not in town. John and I go back at least 32 years. 1986 is as I remember. That was the year. At that time, John was with Oxford, and he will tell his story. And we were just recalling today that year when Rajiv Gandhi's government came into power in 1985. They appointed one of our colleagues, Pankaj Roy, as a consultant on voluntary sector in the Planning Commission. And in his enthusiasm, we are all enthusiastic when we are young.
Some of us enthusiastic.
Even now, yes, that Bankar proposed to the then government of Rajiv Gandhi that a legislation in Parliament should be introduced to define who is a legitimate voluntary organization and who is not, basically. To which some protest happened, and as you know, I was also involved in leading some of that protest. And the result of that was that it was stalled, and subsequent to that, Wadi was born as a platform to carry this forward. John and I met in the midst of this, and John had a portfolio of advocacy in Oxford. He will tell his part of the story in this. Then, of course, we met, we engaged, we continued. And then the next time we met was when he came to this building. And that was in 92. And I remember that because we had just finished our 10th anniversary celebration, which was held here. And at that time, this used to be an amphitheater. Those of you who don't know, this used to be an amphitheater. There were steps for people to sit, and there was a stage. The whole place was as big. And as typically happens on PRIA's birthdays and festive occasions, it rains, and it poured on the night. We had a 2-day function. There was across the street, the empty space. There was a bigger space empty. We put shamiana and tent and all. And first evening started pouring. Second day morning, the shamiana was shining. So we squeezed as many people as we could. So first night, the musical program led by none other than Gopal Bhai was conducted here. And so that was what this used to be in 1992 era. And John, in that meeting, talked to me about his intention. He had been offered a position in the World Bank as social development specialist.
Heading the civil society.
In fact, heading the civil society program at that time. It was the first sort of role of the civil society.
Yeah.
And I remember our conversation vividly because he said, you know, some of the friends I have spoken to are skeptical whether I should join the enemy called the World Bank. So I sort of said, no, John, people like you inside will big. And lo and behold, he worked to build the first participation policy in the World Bank in 94, 95. And in 94, by that time, I got onto the NGO working group of the World Bank. And I faced worse than what he faced. A whole lot of people in India said, you have joined the enemy and boycott. I was the chair of Wani at that time because Wani was legally incorporated only in 1990 or 91. And several people protested that I should step down as chair of Wani because I've joined the enemy. And with John inside the bank, and we worked very well on operationalizing the participation policy of the bank, held a number of studies, conducted meetings in the bank. My favorite is Belly of the Beast meetings, or basement meetings with Wolfenson as the president. And then out of that came, emerged, and John was very active in that, the International Forum on Capacity Building of Southern NGOs. The first ever, we don't talk about firsts in PRIA's history, but first ever multi-stakeholder platform, which had Southern NGOs, Northern NGOs, international bilaterals, international multilaterals. The bank, European Union, USAID, Canadian CEDA, Swedish CEDA, the network of US PBOs, network of European NGOs, networks in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And the first secretariat of that was housed here in PRIA. So after that, John, of course, moved on, and when he was in East Asia division of the bank, we did the major program in Cambodia on capacity building and social accountability, and that led to an expansion of the stream of our work in that.
And you and Christoph were really important trainers.
Yeah, we were trainers, and then we got their delegation to come here. A wonderful program of spread over 3-4 years. So, over the years, it has been an excellent journey. John has written extensively. Some of you may have read his books, those who are studying civil society. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us this afternoon, John. He is one of his partner Mary's special hobby is bird watching, and they travel around the world last 6-7 years, especially after he has sort of left a full-time job watching birds. And because India is so polluted now, there are not many.
Beautiful birds.
I'm hoping you'll come back again. So, welcome, John.
Thank you.
And, he will tell us what brings him here, and then we will have a conversation.
So,
we will have to close the conversation at 5:15 because we will have to leave and catch a flight. But great to have you.
it's so lovely to be here and feel the energy that PRIA always exudes. I'm really pleased to be here. And I have to apologise that because of travel before coming here, I hadn't had time to prepare for this seminar. So I said yes, when I just asked him to give a seminar, I said yes, as long as it's informal. And he took me at his word, and that's why we're sitting in the outdoors. Nice and informal. So please really jump in with any questions or comments, and let's make it really informal. But I wanted to pick up from, I made a few notes on the car on the way over here. But you know how bumpy the Delhi roads are, so I may not always be able to read my notes. But picking up from Rajesh's introduction, my career has always been in development, and really in particular, it's been about building bridges between civil society organisations and governments and the role of intergovernmental bodies and that sort of thing. And it's a role that's involved a hell of a lot of tension because of this mistrust that exists and so on. And I think in the days when we were talking about going back to the early days of the World Bank NGO Committee and so on, it really was two worlds that weren't expected to speak to each other and were mutually suspicious of each other. And I think nowadays it's actually much more common. I mean, if you look at what the World Bank is doing now, if you look at the annual meetings of the World Bank, they always have major element contributions of civil society and that sort of thing. It's not exceptional anymore, it's being mainstreamed. But because I suppose my role has involved the early stages of that, where there was so much mistrust. And so many of my friends from my early NGO days, really challenged, why have you joined the enemy and that sort of thing. And moving headway, trying to get issues of participation on the agenda, trying to open up the process, get more transparency in the World Bank, generate a culture of senior people in the World Bank thinking that part of their job to be to hear for themselves the reality of the grassroots, which means talking to CEOs and civil society organisations working with grassroots. But there was, I did feel a lot of tension. And then an engineer friend of mine said, well, of course you will, because your job is about building bridges. Any engineer will tell you that the study of engineering is all about understanding stresses and tensions and how to manage them. So that made me feel a little bit better. I think that in the years that I've worked on civil society issues, I think the ascendancy of civil society has actually been astounding. Really, truly astounding. And I don't just mean in terms of the numbers of organisations and the budgets, collective budgets in civil society, and indeed the diversity of the sector. But I think astounding in the sense of the increased importance of what it does, in terms of the practical contributions to development, in terms of the influence that civil society has, in terms of shaping the development agenda, in terms of the innovation. Everything which is mainstream today by the official agencies was innovated yesterday by civil society organisations. So that role. The authority of leadership on thinking about development issues, environment issues, and now we talk about environmental development as they're the opposite sides of the same coin, which indeed they are. But previously, before civil society explained this, they were two different universes. So I think in so many ways, civil society, NGOs have really changed the agenda, influenced the agenda. And that power to affect the agenda and therefore affect the world we live in, I think is something that everybody who's worked in civil society shares that ownership in what is an astounding achievement. There are many heroes in this. Many people who really led innovations and that sort of thing. I think above all, there's a sort of relatively handful of people who really stood out in terms of recognizing the moment, recognizing what's being missed, and changing the agenda. And of those, Rajesh is one. So it's been a terrific honor for me to be able to connect with Rajesh many times over the decades. I'm always, every time Rajesh asks me to do something, I always have to say yes. So I'm very pleased to be here. As you'll tell, I'm by nature an optimist, and I am upbeat about the dynamics of civil society and so on. But I also acutely aware of three major trends, which I think are severely eroding civil society. And this erosion of the sector, I would say that my three threats are the erosion of the civic space. I think in part because of the successes in terms of changing the agenda, there's a pushback from that, and there's the challenge about civil society, and that manifests in terms of more restrictive legislation. Even in India, which has been, open to civil society probably longer than my own country. Even in India, there's a tighter use of FRCA, restrictions on freedoms of civil society is there, but in other countries it's become very, very serious. And actually I'm very pleased to be, another hat that I wear is with an organisation which I know is close to PRIA, but the International Centre for Not-for-Profit Law is the international organisation that's probably led the thinking on this whole issue. And we were successful a few years ago in pressing the UN Human Rights body to create a post of a special rapporteur on the rights of association and the rights of peaceful assembly. So we now have that as an official global guardian of the space for civil society. But we need that, and we need organisations like ICNL, because throughout the world there are numbers of examples of legislation which harms, or government practices that harms the space, restricts the space for civil society, really serious. So that's the first erosion. The second erosion is the independence of civil society, the erosion of that independence. And part of this, I think, is the sort of increasing awareness that governments had, particularly in the 80s and 90s, of what civil society can do, and the services that it provides, and the cost-effectiveness in which civil society can reach out to deliver services or help poor people and that sort of thing. And what followed from that was, first of all, well, as governments, or as bodies like the World Bank, we ought to put some funding into this, we ought to help this. And for the first few years, there was, I think, a nice relationship in terms of more official funding going into civil society. Then these fellows in DFID or in the World Bank or the UN, they started thinking, hey, well, this NGO did a really good job here, so we're going to now develop a program that is mainstreaming, and sometimes I find the word mainstreaming a very misleading word, but we're going to sort of support this. We're going to contract NGOs in 20 different countries to take up this program. And by the way, we think actually we can do something a little bit better if they do this, this, and this. And we're going to insist that the organisations who do this have a log frame, and that log frame has to have these elements in it, and we'll monitor them to make sure. And before you know what's happened, the NGOs who used to be getting grants because they did a good job with civil society become contractors for the donors that first saw this as being good, but somehow thought, in their arrogance, thought that they could do a better job of designing the program. So that's, I think, the second erosion. And I think part of that is a differentiation between the community that we are, a civil society, where you've got the good NGOs that do services and can deliver these programs, and some of the services are quite radical, women's empowerment and that sort of thing, versus the advocacy organisations or rights promoters and so on. So by supporting one set, but not supporting the other, there is a tension created within the community that used to be more harmonious. So I think that the second threat I feel is this erosion of the independence of the sector, and if you like, almost a sort of privatisation, or a publicisation, the opposite of privatisation of that sector. And the third element, which may be more, I don't know, in Western countries, northern countries, than it is in India, but it's the erosion of public trust in the sector. And I think it relates to the earlier point, because I think now you've got a lot of big NGOs that are highly dependent on public funding, that are a little different from private sector contractors, whose chief executive get pretty high salaries. And what goes with that is a sort of question, and you see a sort of a revolving door between people who used to work in the big corporate sector moving into heading up some of these operational NGOs and so on. So I think what goes with that is a questioning of what happened? How ethical are these organisations? These NGOs, they claim to be on the side of the poor. Look at the cars they drive, look at the salaries they get, and so on. And I think all of these areas of erosion are, in a sense, combined, are a sort of backlash against the fact that the ascendancy of civil society in terms of the influence on the global agenda, particularly the global development agenda, and how to address that, I think, is all to do with issues of accountability. They're not all to do with issues of accountability, but the questions about the erosion of civic space, the way to defend that is to really clearly state that we are, as civil society organisations, we are as accountable to people as governments are accountable to people. So it's not for you governments to restrict us, and in a way, it's for us as representatives of the citizens to restrict you. The erosion of the independence, this issue of how we truly independent the civil society organisations, that's an accountability issue. When you think about accountability, if what you mean is the reports that you provide to donors, especially when those donors are governmental organisations, you're not part of civil society anymore. Civil society is a society of the citizen. So if you're a civil society organisation, you should be answerable and accountable to citizens, not to donors, especially donors in a different country. And similarly, that's what the issues of public trust. If you're not really being honest about what you're doing, and not necessarily honest, but open about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and indeed justifying why you have certain salaries and that sort of thing, why you have certain recruitment policies. If you're not doing that, then you're not truly accountable in the directions that you should be. So accountability is central to all these issues, and strengthening accountability in civil society is, I think, a very major part of the defence against these threats that I do think are very serious, sometimes existential threats. And it's the reason why I'm in Delhi, because a lot of international NGOs, big international NGOs, realised the importance of this issue. Some years ago, it's been a matter of increasing recognition, because it was a major question of importance that we need to address. Just this last year or so, it's been elevated. I don't know, I think word of it has reached the UK, has reached India, but Oxfam was involved in a major scandal earlier this year, and it hit the newspapers and it shook everybody in Oxfam. Led to the resignation of some of my dearest friends, because actually they were just burned out in response to this. And it was a serious and important lapse that I don't think anybody would try and justify what happened. But the severity of it, I think, points to the threats that civil society face. I know it's not very tasteful to describe it, but I will just spend a couple of minutes describing what happened. In 2011, there was an earthquake. In response to the earthquake in Haiti, Oxfam assembled a team of people to go out and be part of the relief and reconstruction effort. Oxfam, I worked for Oxfam for 15 years, and I was always on the development side. We used to see the humanitarian side as the cowboys of the organisation, because they were always ready to jump on a plane and go places, and within 5 minutes landing somewhere, they were beginning to take action. You would have to have several meetings before thinking about what our strategy was going to be and so on. But the thing about disaster response is that you have to assemble a team really, really swiftly. If Oxfam had taken 2 months to assemble a team to go out and start helping, people would have been asking questions. What's this organisation doing? You give all our money to this organisation? It should be, has to be there, has to be the first organisation to be seen there, has to be there when the journalists arrive. If it's not there when the journalists arrive, already doing things, then there's questions about why aren't you there? What Oxfam tends to do in this situation, I always, my wife teases me, I still use the word we when I'm talking about Oxfam. Oxfam specialises in water and sanitation work and logistics and food supplies and that sort of thing. But water and sanitation, none of the other organisations that do mainstream disaster relief work are as good as Oxfam in that area. So what we need are people who are engineers, people who are heavy on logistics, because you're dealing with huge plane loads and shiploads of stuff coming in very quickly. And typically, you're looking for people like who've got military, coming out of military background, and people who can drop things at the moment's notice, and the next day go on to go on the plane, cover. You're talking a lot about young men out of armies and engineers. And these are people who are not always perfect. And some of them use prostitutes. And that's what happened in this situation. Some of them were quite openly cavorting with prostitutes. About 5 or 6 of the 200 that were assembled there. And I think rightly, some of the women in the team didn't like this, reported in the headquarters. There was an investigation. A few people were sacked, a couple of people were allowed to resign. And resulting from that, maybe you should have been quicker, but there was a sort of stronger code of conduct that developed that made it very clear if you use prostitutes, you were sacked. Now, all of this was documented, of course, and was in files in Oxfam. A journalist, 7 years later, got access, again, a whistleblower inside, shared this with the media, and it came out in the open. Now, it wasn't at all pleasant, but I think it's actually staggering how much was made of this. And it was splashed over, particularly the Times newspaper. Acres of coverage given to this scandal of Oxfam staff using prostitutes. Well, 7 years ago, 5 people, 6 people did, and they were sacked. If it was a private sector company, if you're talking about, say, a mainstream engineering company that was out there in Haiti building a road, I don't think anybody would turn a blind eye to the fact that 5 or 6 of their engineers were going off with prostitutes. It wouldn't have been an issue. But Oxfam, because of its advocacy and campaign work, has a bitter enemy in the face, in the form of somebody called Rupert Murdoch, who happens to own the Times. And this was backlash time. We have now a very conservative government. Penny Wharton is one of the most conservative people. She happens to be a minister. She doesn't like NGOs who tell her what development is about. She likes the organisations that produce services. And similarly, on the Charity Commission, chairman of the Charity Commission is someone from an Eton, I don't know if you know, but Eton is the most elite school in the UK. The son of Lord Shawcross exudes eliteness. But he was the chairman of the Charity Commission, and Oxfam is seen as being the anti-establishment development organisation. So, I think what we see is not remarkable in terms of a few people in this team inappropriate behaviour, but it was the way in which the mainstream in the UK used that to get back at Oxfam. Oxfam lost about £40 million, it's estimated, as a result of this scandal. It's horrific that it happened, and it's tragic that this money was lost. There is a bittersweet rival to this, which was a wealthy industrialist who made his will a few years ago. His lawyer advised in the will all the money was going to go to his wife and his children, and advised him, well, why don't you, supposing, I know it's unlikely, but supposing something happens when the whole family is wiped out, what would you like done with? And he said, I thought it ought to go to Oxfam. There was a helicopter crash. The whole family was killed. And Oxfam got a legacy of £41 million. I wouldn't cheer, but it was
Ironic.
Anyway, the reason I'm in Delhi is that, as I mentioned, the issues of accountability are, I think, of increasing importance in the NGO world, particularly the big NGOs. And I think the Oxfam illustration I said from two doctors writing is an example of how, if you're not fully accountable, if you don't have a terrifically well-functioning complaints process, including the internal complaints and so on, if you're not absolutely clear that sexual harassment or sexual malpractices are terribly important to address early on and to address really, strongly, and if you're not fully transparent in how you implement these good policies. And I think in the case of Oxfam did put out a statement at the time saying we've taken action because of inappropriate behaviour of 6 members of staff are now leaving Haiti. But that was considered in the cold light of day 10 years later, or 8 years later. Perhaps Oxfam should have been much more candid and described the nature of the offences and the reasons why these people were sacked. But so this and other issues have made clear that issues of accountability are something that that NGOs need to take much more seriously, especially as we in the NGO world are so often demanding accountability on the part of governments, local governments, corporations, and so on. Accountability and greater transparency. We need to recognise that mirror is going to be held up to us to say, well, how accountable are you? How transparent are you? I think NGOs need, in a way, to model the sorts of practices that they would love to see at work in the corporate and the governmental world. So the key issues of accountability, obviously to do with the programme, demonstrating that you're making an impact, demonstrating that you're doing something to make sure that impact is sustained, that it's not just a sort of flash in the pan. Here's something that's good for a year, but then it evaporates. Increasingly, a lot of attention on stakeholder accountability. So not just accountability to donors, but carefully identifying who your stakeholders are, who are the people who are impacted by your work, and finding ways of making sure that they are fully involved in the processes of accountability and contribute to the thinking and the strategy of your organisation. Clearly issues to do with the structures for governance or the board and that sort of thing. But we think increasingly important is the relevance of complaints mechanisms, complaints processes both at the programme level for people who are impacted in the work, but also if there are grievances, like in the Haiti case, there's a much more immediate and obvious way in which those issues are addressed. And also that stakeholder involvement in helping to shape the advocacy type of work. So it's not just listening to what partners say in terms of developing the program, but when we say these are the root causes of poverty, or these are the issues that we want to take to the political agenda of Davos or the World Bank IMF annual meetings and so on, are we truly speaking the priorities that we're hearing from the grassroots level or not? So, as a result of a deliberation over a few years, this group of about 24 international NGOs, and they comprise the development organisations like Oxfam, World Vision, ActionAid, Plan, BRAC in Bangladesh, CARE, Islamic Relief, and so on. Besides those development organisations, we've got environment groups like Greenpeace, Terre des Hommes, Solidarity Now, we've got environment groups, we've got human rights and other groups like Amnesty, Transparency International, Article 19, International Planned Parenthood Federation, Site Savers. So it's a sort of quite an eclectic mix of service type, development type, human rights types, advocacy organisations and programming organisations. And they collectively drew up an agenda of what does accountability mean? In order to demonstrate that we're accountable, what are the commitments that we need to make? And they came up with this set, and in fact in this whole process there was a lot of focus group meetings and so on in a range of developing countries, including here in India with Bami, and it sort of identified a set of 12 commitments to, I've got here, and I can leave just one here, but I can leave it behind, a description of these 12 commitments. 12 accountability commitments. So that's one thing, having commitments, but then how do we put some substance to those commitments? Well, part of it is forming a formal organisational network, a platform, which is called Accountable Now, which then comprises these 24 or so organisations and represents, in a sense, a peer support and peer pressure mechanism for adhering to these. But as you all know, because you're all members of different networks and so on, being a member of a network and actually doing anything different and making a pledge and doing something different are quite different things. So to give teeth to this, it was decided to set up something called the Independent Review Panel, which every 2 years, these organisations have to prepare and submit a report which documents what, on each of these commitments, it's doing to demonstrate that it's actually adhering to these. And as an independent panel, by the way, I chair that independent panel at the moment, and there are 8 people on this panel. And we all come from NGO backgrounds. A lot of people now are either retired or semi-retired, and they're maybe consulting within the sector, so they don't necessarily represent big organisations. We've got Mihir Bhatt, who is from the All India Disaster Management Institute, based in Ahmedabad. We've got somebody from Accenture, there's a charitable side of Accenture, which gives a lot of advice to NGOs, and she leads that program. So we've got a few people from the private sector background, but mostly people from NGO background. So we then set a series of questions, about 35, 40 questions, that we think probe whether organisations are serious about the 12 commitments that they've made. And every 2 years, the organisations submit a report, which we then go through. We do a little bit of homework looking at the organisation, a bit of web-based, we're not going into the field and don't have the resources to do that. But we will then prepare a draft response to these reports, which we think highlights issues where we are not satisfied that the organisation is really meeting up to the commitment. We'll then schedule a call, usually with the chief executive or somebody the chief executive nominates, plus the head of MEL, and we'll have maybe a 2-hour telephone conversation on the issues that we think are sticking points. We then revise our feedback to the organisation, and then that report from them and our feedback is put into the public domain. And that feedback from us has a list of homework. These are what we call improvement areas. These are the things that we think are priorities for you to address. And then 2 years later, that's the most important thing that we look at with the next round of reports. So, this is a bit haphazard, but I wanted to start with some reflections on where I think are key issues in the sector, in the civil society sector that we're dealing with. Why accountability is important to all of these, and the relevance of this mechanism of which I'm a part, this accountable denial mechanism, to helping organisations to address this. And one of the things that we're doing is recognising that, particularly at the country level and sometimes regional level, NGO networks, civil society networks are addressing with similar issues. So we've got part of what our secretariat, we have a small secretariat based in Berlin, about 6 or 7 people. And one of the things that they do is to reach out to networks, particularly in developing countries, and help reflecting on these same sort of principles here. So one of the partners, for example, is Varney. So we've been, our secretariat has been doing some work with Varney in terms of developing code practice here in India. We've done that in Uganda, Kenya, and Mexico, and a few other countries. Anyway, let me stop there. And
Thank you.